Good afternoon, everyone. I ought to say that when I was invited to become the editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Oxford University Press sent somebody from marketing to try to persuade me that this was something I should take on. For reasons that will become apparent, he has since been moved to another department. And this is because his pitch was to say to me, the great thing about being the editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is that when you die, you're guaranteed your own entry. I said rather grandly, I thought I'd have got in anyway, but he's been moved on from marketing to somewhere else where his talents may be more appropriately applied. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I particularly want to thank Jamie Balfour for making it possible. I'm delighted to be part of this special day celebrating the Golden Jubilee of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, which of course coincides with the 50th anniversary of Winston Churchill's death in 1965. It seems to me that the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust is one of these marvellously innovative ways of remembering and commemorating a great figure by helping to transform in his name and in his memory the lives of many other people. And it's clear from the talks today and from the posters on display that many people's lives have been transformed by the award of these fellowships. And it's a great pleasure for me to come here this afternoon and to say that, even though I'm sure you all know it already. And I also, beyond that, want to thank Jamie Balfour and his colleagues at the Trust for all the help and support they've given in this Churchill anniversary year to Churchill 2015, the umbrella organisation overseeing the many different aspects of commemoration and education and legacy this year. Now, that's the easy bit of my lecture, which is to pay heartfelt thanks to Jamie and a heartfelt tribute to this scheme. The hard bit of this lecture is that I have to do Churchill the Man in 30 minutes. This is, of course, completely impossible. It's rather like being asked to describe and explain the fall of the Roman Empire in half an hour. Anyway, I will have a go. Can I start with an allusion to an old friend of mine who I much miss, Roy Jenkins. In later life, Roy wrote the life of Gladstone, the greatest 19th century British Prime Minister, and a biography of Churchill, the greatest 20th century Prime Minister. And he concluded at the end of the life of Churchill, which was the second one that he'd written, comparing him with Gladstone, that Churchill was the most remarkable human being ever to have occupied 10 Downing Street. And although, of course, David Cameron now enjoys an overall majority of a kind that he didn't before, I don't think that result of the general election in any way obliges us to modify that verdict of Roy Jenkins's. Now, it's fair to say that some people think that Gladstone was actually the greater man than Churchill, and some other people might say, well, what about the Duke of Wellington? Always a great mistake to forget the Duke of Wellington, as Napoleon discovered to his cost. And we certainly shouldn't forget him in this year, the bicentennial of the Battle of Waterloo. I think there is a case that Wellington was at least as remarkable a figure and an occupant of 10 Downing Street as Gladstone or Churchill. In any event, and whatever outcome those comparative exercises produce, it is incontrovertible that Churchill was indeed a very remarkable man. And it seems to me that as the time elapses between his death and where we are now, and as that gap gets greater, the perspective on him lengthens and he becomes in many ways more remarkable, not less. But let me further preface my remarks by alluding to one other person who wrote a piece called Churchill the Man, which was Anthony Storr's essay in a book of essays which revived and reappraised Churchill quite soon after his death, with pieces by Robert Rhodes James, Basil Littlehart, and J.H. Plum and A.J.P. Taylor. And what Storr did was to subject Churchill to a kind of retrospective psychoanalysis. He drew attention to Churchill's deprived childhood. He noted that Churchill was physically a rather unprepossessing figure, that he was self-educated but not formally very well educated, and that on many occasions in his life he suffered from depression. And he suggested that one of the explanations for Churchill's extraordinary creativity and constant activity was the attempt to keep what Churchill called the black dog of depression at bay. And he also suggested, rather interestingly I think, that Churchill was a man in some senses who lived against his own nature, that he constantly willed himself, despite the deprived childhood, the physical unprepossessiveness, the lack of a formal education, the depressive temperament. He constantly willed himself to be a hero. That was what he wanted to be, even though, as it were, the building blocks of his brain and body were not themselves particularly heroic. And Storr's final point was that Churchill was actually an amazingly lucky man, because in 1940 he actually did become the hero he had always dreamed he wanted to be. And that, as it were, Churchill's inner fantasy world for once coincided with the external reality of events. Well, that's perhaps overdoing it a bit, but it's a rather interesting set of thoughts about Churchill, the man, and it provides, in some senses, some of the themes that I would now like to explore myself. First of all, of course, it has to be said that Churchill's life was extraordinary, both in its length and its range, and in terms of the sort of life he lived, and in terms of the sort of career he had. He was, after all, an astonishingly long-lived man, certainly by the standards of the time. The age expectancy in the late 19th century was still not much above 40. Churchill lived from 1874 to 1965. He was in public life for 2/3 of the 20th century. He served under 6 monarchs. He participated in the last cavalry charge in the British Army and lived long enough to brood over what he saw as the terrible threat presented by the hydrogen bomb. He was about 30 before Orville and Wilbur Wright took to the air, yet he lived long enough to see the world of Concorde and manned spaceflight. It was an astonishingly long life, encompassing an amazing variety of historical change and, in his own case, human experience. He was not only a long-lived man, he was also, of course, a many-sided man. The day job was being a politician, a party leader, a prime minister, and a world statesman. But in addition, he was, of course, a soldier, a journalist, a historian, a biographer, a racehorse owner, a painter, a bricklayer, and he did all that besides politics. Dennis Healy once said that it was very important for politicians to have a hinterland. Churchill had lots and lots and lots of hinterlands, more, I think, than any other major political figure, certainly in the 20th century. Churchill was not only long-lived and many-sided, he was also, of course, a very famous man. Indeed, from 1940 until 1965, he was the most famous and the most celebrated man in the world. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and the citation said, "Usually the Nobel Prize brings luster to the winner. This time the winner brings luster to the Nobel Prize." A totally unsurpassable tribute. He was, of course, an honorary citizen of the United States. Honorary degrees were conferred upon him by the great universities of Western Europe and Britain, and, of course, the United States as well. He was acclaimed in his lifetime as the greatest Englishman of his time, as the saviour of his country, and according to Time magazine in 1949, as the man of the half-century. And on his 80th birthday and on his 90th birthday, cards were sent to him from all over the world, which simply said, "The greatest man in England, London," and they were all delivered to Churchill's address. The postal service was more efficient then than it is now. In addition, of course, and this was one of Anthony Storr's insights, Churchill did see himself as a man of destiny from a very early age. Perhaps if you were born in a place like this, you would feel you were a more than usually important figure. As a soldier on the frontiers of empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, he regularly wrote to his mother saying, "I am being protected by God for some higher purpose." Churchill's novel, Savrola, which he wrote in the late 19th century and ever after, discouraged all his friends from reading because he thought it was terribly bad. But in fact, it's a hugely revealing novel because it's Churchill writing a fictional account of a heroic figure who, by the force of his rhetoric, changes the course of history. It's Churchill's account, in fact, of the person he wanted to be and the person in the end he became, and it's about a man of destiny. One of Churchill's critics, when Churchill was a radical liberal reformer in the 1900s, observed, "Winston has discovered the poor, whom he thinks he is sent by God to do something about." And in 1940, of course, Churchill later wrote that he felt he was walking with destiny and that all his past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. Well, that's, as it were, one version of Churchill the man. Let me now give another version of Churchill the man. On the one side, I've talked about the extraordinary length and range of his career, But what we also need to take into account is the extraordinary vicissitudes of Churchill's career. It was a kind of snakes and ladders life, if I can put it that way. To begin with, it's important to notice that for almost the whole of his life, Churchill was a very controversial man. He made an awful lot of enemies in politics. He was thought to be too ambitious, too egotistical, too self-interested, too self-serving. And also, in part perhaps as a result of that, or that's why he made the enemies, he made a lot of mistakes. And because he was in public life for so long, it was a very long list, at least according to the enemies he had made. Tonypandy, where it was claimed he'd sent the troops in against the miners. The Dardanelles, a complete military fiasco in the First World War. Chanak, a foreign policy fiasco in the aftermath of the First World War. The return to the gold standard at the wrong rate and probably at the wrong time. His belligerent behaviour during the general strike. His equally belligerent hostility to the Government of India Act of 1935, his support of Edward VIII at the time of the abdication, and his ill-judged comments in the 1945 general election, likening the Labour leaders who had been his loyal lieutenants in the wartime coalition as people who, if elected, would introduce some form of Gestapo into Britain. So Churchill made a lot of mistakes and he made a lot of enemies. He was, in addition to all the other sorts of man I've described, a controversial man. He was also thought, in part as an explanation of what I've just said, to be an unsound man. The general view of Churchill up to 1940, and in many quarters even after that, he's very brilliant, but he's very flawed. He had no judgment. He did not inspire trust. To spend days and nights in laborious administration, to speak with the tongues of men and of angels, Asquith said of him, is of no value if a man does not inspire trust. Many people also thought he was enslaved by the power of his own words, that any policy, any idea, if he could clothe it in rhetorical plausibility, which he unfailingly could, would therefore seem attractive, whatever the substantive merits or not might be. He never could, Harold Nicholson said, resist the cadences of a phrase. For instance, the soft underbelly of the Axis. Well, Italy didn't turn out to be anything like that in the Second World War, but it was a very good phrase. He was thought to be too self-absorbed. He was thought to be an adventurer. He changed his party twice. He was therefore seen as wayward, unreliable, no judgment. Lord Beaverbrook once said he has held every opinion on every question. And Lord Beaverbrook was a friend. I slightly blush to mention the following quotation in this august place, but Mr. Gladstone once said, "There never was a Churchill from John, Duke of Marlborough down, who had either morals or principles." And that quote was often used as a description of Churchill himself. He was also, in many ways, an unsuccessful man. He had announced in the 1900s that he wanted to be Prime Minister and he was going to be Prime Minister soon. By 1939, that looked in retrospect a preposterously vainglorious boastfulness. He did not and had not become Prime Minister. His career crashed into ruins in 1915 in the aftermath of the Dardanelles disaster. He laboriously rebuilt it, but in 1929, when he ceased to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, it looked as if it was over again. Hence, of course, the title of Robert Rhodes James's book, Churchill, A Study in Failure, 1900 to 1939. But the failures didn't stop then. Remember in 1945, the year which Churchill covered in the last volume of his war memoirs called Triumph and Tragedy, there were a lot of tragedies. Roosevelt died, Churchill was thrown out by an ungrateful electorate, or so it seemed, and of course Russia took over large parts of Eastern Europe. Britain had gone to war to defend Poland's freedom. Well, the Poles weren't celebrating much in 1945. It's also important to notice that although Churchill returned as Prime Minister in 1951, even that year the Labour Party got more votes than the Conservative Party got. Churchill, as Conservative Party leader, never won a majority of the popular vote. And of course, from 1951 to 1955, Churchill's great preoccupation was the attempt to broker a peace deal between the United States and Soviet Russia, and he did not succeed in doing so. So even after 1940, there were a string of, as it were, failures or question marks still set against him. Also, fourthly, Churchill was, both personally and for broader and political reasons, on many occasions in his life, an unhappy man. He was afflicted by the black dog of depression. especially in the aftermath of the Dardanelles disaster, when Clementine said she thought he would die of grief. That's when he took up painting as therapy. But Churchill was also an unhappy man in the last years of his life because he came to feel that the whole purpose of his life had been in vain. He explained at one point that he had been in public life to safeguard the greatness of Britain and the greatness of the British Empire. And by 1965, it was pretty clear that in that enterprise he had failed. And there are two terrible quotations from late in his life which must rank as some of the saddest words ever uttered by a great man in extremis. "We passed all the tests, but it was useless," was one of his comments. The fact that although Britain was on the winning side in 1945, that could not prevent Britain's decline from being a major world power in the remaining years of Churchill's life and, of course, since. And the one that's even sadder, which is recorded in several memoirs of the time, is Churchill saying, "I have achieved so much to have achieved in the end nothing," by which he meant that the great endeavour of his life to perpetuate Britain as a great power and the British Empire had in the end failed. And so there is this curious paradox that the last 10 years of his life, when he was undeniably the most venerated man on earth, were also years of enormous sadness for him. Well, let me try to balance this up a bit more. Churchill the Man is a very complicated and protean figure, as perhaps what I've already said might suggest. And let me now add a third strand, as it were, to what I'm trying to put together here. It's hugely important, I think, to notice that Churchill was an astonishingly clever and creative man. He had an amazingly powerful mind, a mind probably all the more powerful because it had not been constrained by the formal limitations of a university education. It was original in a whole variety of ways. Many people said they never quite knew what view Churchill would take on almost any subject. It was a mind which played across the whole gamut of human activity, from science, in which Churchill had an enormous interest, to painting, at which he was quite accomplished. And of course it took the form of huge numbers of books, of paintings, of brick walls, and beyond that, of course, the major contribution to public life which Churchill contributed in terms of his speeches, in terms of his state papers, and in terms of the Acts of Parliament which he steered through. He was clever, creative, and extraordinarily energetic. He was also an exceptionally resilient man, again, personally and politically. Many times in his career he was written off, and every time he came back. After the Dardanelles disaster of 1915, after his apparent exclusion into the wilderness in 1929, after his electoral defeat in 1945, and after his stroke in 1953. He was amazingly tough and amazingly resilient personally. But he was also, as it were, politically and as a public figure, exceptionally tough and exceptionally resilient. And never more so than in the period from 1940 on to late 1941 and even on into 1942, coping with the threat of invasion, coping with the Battle of Britain, coping with bombing, coping with the Battle of the Atlantic, coping with the fall of Tobruk, the fall of Singapore, and wondering whether the United States would ever in fact come in on Britain's side, as Churchill desperately wanted. We will never actually know, but it seems impossible not to feel that no one else could have borne the burdens that Churchill bore, especially during those years, but throughout the whole of the Second World War. And I think it's impossible not to agree with Max Hastings' view in his book on Churchill as a warlord, that whatever mistakes he made, surveying Churchill's conduct from 1940 to 1945, it is impossible to be anything other than overwhelmed by the sustained magnificence of his performance. It's also the case that in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, Churchill was a very prescient man. He may have been interested in history, but he wasn't bad at foretelling the future on certain occasions either. He did notice that the Bolsheviks were pretty awful, and he wasn't wrong about that. He noticed that Hitler was pretty awful, and he wasn't wrong about that. He thought there was going to be a new Cold War in the aftermath of the Second World War, and he wasn't wrong about that. But he also thought eventually that America and Russia would have to come to terms and do business and learn to get on with each other. And at least for a time, in the late 1980s and 1990s, it seemed as though that prediction had come out right as well. It's also, I suppose, important, although these are very difficult things to re-evoke once the person in question is no longer with us, he was an astonishingly charismatic man. The eloquence, the wit, the charm, the magnanimity, the sense of history, the extraordinary capacity both for hard work on the one side and for amazingly good living on the other. And for Churchill, good living was not the negation of the proper discharge of public duty, it was the essential precondition for the proper discharge of public duty. An insight which Roy Jenkins, of whom the same could also be said, understood very well in his biography. All of which is but another way of saying that Churchill lived life with a kind of intensity and with a range of activity and accomplishments denied we lesser mortals. Everything about him was on a larger-than-life scale. And again, if you'd been born in a larger-than-life house like this one, that might become, as it were, the watchword of your life, as in Churchill's case, it certainly did. One way of trying to sum this up, or trying to sum Churchill up, which is astonishingly difficult to do for the reasons in a sense I've just given, is that the more Churchill's life recedes into the distance, the more extraordinary his career and personality and life become. And it's easy to think in terms of Churchill of Dryden's marvellous phrase, a man so various that he seemed to be not one but all mankind's epitome. He was in many ways a time-bound figure. He was in many ways a flawed figure. He made lots of mistakes and lots of enemies. But he was, nevertheless, and in spite of all that, and in some ways even because of all that, he was a great man. When Churchill left the House of Commons in 1964, a motion was passed in favour of saying how wonderful he had been and expressing Parliament's unbounded admiration. And Harold Macmillan ended his speech on that occasion by saying to the assembled House, "The oldest among us here can recall nothing to compare with it. And the youngest of you, however long you live, will never look upon the like again." And that prediction has certainly been fully borne out. Well, if you don't believe me or if you don't believe Harold Macmillan, let me offer two other figures in support of what I've just said. The first one is Paul Addison, who wrote what is still the best brief biography of Churchill, and which indeed began life as the entry on Churchill in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, though it was commissioned and written long before I became general editor. So I can say with no vested interest, it's a marvellous piece. This is what Addison wrote. In the last years of his life, oppressed by physical decay and the black dog of depression, he began to think that his life's work had come to nothing. Those are the quotations that I gave you earlier. There is no need to accept this verdict. Whatever the price the British paid for victory in the Second World War, the cost of defeat would have been much greater. In all its essentials, Churchill was right about the rise of Hitler's Germany, the need for rearmament and collective security, and the necessity of waging war. Without him, the whole of Europe, Britain included, might have experienced decades of Nazi rule. And Addison goes on. Churchill sometimes blundered, but his giant stature does not rest on the claim that he was always right. Right or wrong, he was an exceptionally great man, by virtue of the extraordinary qualities he possessed. In his obituary of Churchill, the Labour politician Michael Foot accused him of numerous failings and follies. But he also wrote, "Seen from any angle, the scale of the figure on the vast canvas is stupendous. Not merely does Churchill bestride the century, not merely has he been a foremost performer in British and world politics for a longer period than almost any rival in ancient or modern times. The same great lineaments are revealed when his particular faculties are examined. His vitality, his brain power, his endurance, his wit, his eloquence, his industry, his application was superabundant, superhuman. The man was huge." So, my final summary, having said it's impossible to do justice to Churchill the man in 30 minutes, which I've just about done, is actually to do justice to Churchill in an even shorter compass. Churchill the man was huge. Thank you.